welcome to Pay It Forward. Now I have a much requested pattern here for you all today. I have been asked for a little elephant so many times and I finally got to it, and thank you all for your patience. All of you have been asking and you know who you are. Here she is finally. Now she's made entirely out of fabric. You can make her fully patchwork, all different sorts of colours, and she's really quite easy to make. There's a couple of new techniques in there that you may not have seen before, so I hope you stay with me. Now you'll need a pattern and I've got that all ready for you, and it's free as usual. So all you need to do is click on that link in the description box below. If you're on a mobile device, you'll need to click that little grey arrow. It's just there. Click on there and that'll open up the description box and you will find your free pattern templates. Now before you go to print them out, make sure that you check your printer settings and set your printer to print at actual size, and that way it won't change your pattern template size. They'll be absolutely spot on. So who's ready for a bit of a challenge? Come on, let's get busy sewing. Right, so let's get started. Let me show you what you'll need to make our little elephant. So let's start with our body pieces. Now this little elephant can be made up in obviously any kind of color scheme that you like, and you can piece the entire thing to make it entirely patchwork. You can have a different fabric for every pattern piece if you like. I like to have some of them matching up, and I've really just gone for the 3 different fabrics in this one. This one, next one, I'm going to go with some nice cool greens and blues for this one. So we start off with our little body pieces. So we've got our 2 body pieces, cut 1 reverse. You'll find all of your cutting instructions on your templates. Make sure that you place your templates following your grain lines. It's very important when we're making something out of a very stable fabric like cotton, that our grain lines are matched up, and also that we have interfacing applied. So I'm using my usual medium weight woven fusible interfacing, so it's a woven cotton interfacing. And make sure when you're interfacing your fabrics that you're also lining up the selvages of your grain lines of your interfacing with the grain lines of your fabric, and that's what gives us a very stable correct little body with no twist, and particularly when we're packing them really firm. So do you need to interface this little project? Absolutely, yes you do. I don't think you'd be very successful without it. So you've got your body sides, and then we need our inside legs pieces, and they are these little pieces here. Then we need our central gusset, and that one is this piece here that goes all the way under his little bottom. And you can see I'm doing a variation of colours here. And then you're going to need your head pieces. So our 2 head pieces. Now my advice on the side head pieces, they're these pieces here, is to keep that fabric fairly plain. You don't want a really big busy print that's going to interfere with seeing our eyes. We want our eyes to be nice and clear and show up. However, when you have your centre gusset here, your centre head gusset, you can add something that's quite detailed there and really make it a bit of a focal point. So I'm going to, you can see that I've purposefully cut that one to have that little bit of foliage there that will sit on that point. And then we will need our little arms. Now the arms on this little one, I'm actually going to give you 2 options, because some of you may find sewing in those little paw pads on those little arms a little bit challenging. We do have to do them on the feet or it really won't look like a little elephant. But if you want a simpler version for the arms, I'm actually going to be demonstrating today with the other arm that I have available for you. They'll both be there in your template, so you can choose. This one is going to be a very basic little chubby little curved arm. So it'll just curve in like that. So that's up to you. You'll see what this one will look like when I put that one together, and you'll be able to make your decisions based on that, or perhaps your skill level with sewing in your little foot pads, and you can take it from there. So we also have our little ears. Now the little ears aren't interfaced. That's unusual for me, I know, but we want these little ears to be lovely and soft and floppy. So we just have, I've got 2 coordinating fabrics so that we've got a pretty colour on the inside of the ear, and we've just got our 2 pairs there. Remember to transfer all of your markings onto your pattern pieces, they're very important. And you'll also need your little foot pads for your little feet down the bottom here. I like to use felt. The foot pads always come up really well in felt, and that felt is also interfaced. If you are making the other style, the little arms that I've got here, you'll also need the little paw pads for those. So you'll also need to create something, or perhaps just use a ready-made cording or something like that for the little tail. You can see with this one, all I've done is taken some yarn and some various colours, and I've just plaited that up, and I have tied a little knot and then trimmed that little edge, so that will give me the little end to the tail. This one's coordinating with these colours this time, and your overall length, make it about 15 centimetres. That gives you a little bit of room to tuck into that seam, and we don't really want a really long elephant tail. So if you've got about 15 centimetres, you're right, you'll have plenty of room. Now this little one is jointed, so it's jointed at the neck and on the arms. Obviously the little feet are also, the little legs are sewn in as part of the body. If you really don't want to joint this little one, you can certainly button joint the arms, which I can tell you how to do as we go through, and you could sew the head onto the body. I totally don't recommend that. It's actually a lot harder to do that. But yes, you definitely can, and if you're a more experienced sewer, you'll be able to do that. I could sew it on, it wouldn't be a problem, but I don't want to give you anything that's too difficult. So if you can jump into using some joints, you're going to find it really, really easy, and a lot of my patterns as we go ahead are going to be using, even if it's just a neck joint. It really does help the little process along. So these are my joints that I have ready for this little project, and this one is the neck joint. It is a 40mm disc, and if you want to know how to make up these little joints, I make them up myself. I've got a video that I'm going to put the link up there for you. It's going to show you exactly how I do that. So I have my neck joint and all of its gear, which is 40mm, and I have 2 arm joints, and they are 30mm, and so they're all set up as well. You can use plastic joints if you can find them in those sizes. They will be fine for the arms, but you really need a proper neck joint if you're going to joint that little head. Now I don't want to deter you from sewing the head on. I just want you to be aware that it's a little bit tricky, because we've got a lovely trunk down here and there's a few things in the way, but you certainly can sew it on. So we are also going to need some eyes, and again you can choose, it will depend on what you're making this little one for. I'm not making it for a very young child. If you're making it just as a little shelf sitter on display, then you can use whatever you like. So I have gone ahead and I'm using glass teddy bear eyes. I'm using them because I can really pull them in from behind, and that gives us that little sunken look, which is really sweet. If you are making it for a child or a baby, you will probably want to use safety eyes. You won't get quite the pull in. They tend to just sort of sit on the surface, but a good effect in the end. So these are 10mm. So if you're using safety eyes, go for about 10mm. Anything smaller tends to make the animal look a little older. And here are the tools. You're going to definitely need a dowel needle throughout this process, a nice long dowel needle. You'll need an awl, an extra, that's a little frog that you can hear there. It's a little frog in my wall. Sounds very happy, doesn't he? Interrupting us. You can use a knitting needle to help with making those holes larger. Definitely your forceps for filling, and a spanner to do up your nuts on your little joints if you're using them, and we are going to be filling with polyester filling. And if you are jointing, we will need some clear craft glue and a little bit of super glue to go on those little bolts as we do them up. You'll need extra strong thread. Majority of this little animal is sewn on the machine, but you will need your extra strong thread for little bits and pieces of it. And you may want to add a little something at the end. If you're making a little girl one, of course, you can add a little flower, any kind of embellishment. I'm just using some little hand crocheted flowers that are really sweet, and I just add them with a button at the end. You can imagine you could put anything on there. You could put a little bow, you could make a little fabric yo-yo. All you quilters certainly know how to do those, and pop one of those on. It's a really sweet little finish. So that's about it with what we need. So we're going to put everything aside, and we're going to start on our body this time. We want to get our little body made first. And our first step is to take our centre body gusset here and our little inner legs. So these are the inner legs here. So those are those pieces, and this is our centre gusset. So what we want to do is make sure that you mark on your pattern pieces that that is your toe, so you know exactly where that one goes in. And we're going to begin by pinning in. You have to remember that that will be our little elephant sitting up, and our toe needs to be upwards, and we have right sides together. So we're going to pin from the gusset side. We're not going to pin from the little leg side. We're going to start, we're going to line up that little edge there, and we're just going to pin that little leg curve into place. And this one we can stitch on the machine, but we really need to tack it into place first. You can see I'm just making those edges fit. And lining it up at the end there, and you'll find that will all fit beautifully. Now the seam allowance throughout this little project is my usual 4mm. It's very important that you stay within that seam allowance, because when you're making something like this with multiple pieces, you'll find that other pieces are dependent on whether or not you kept that seam allowance. So little things like foot pads and so on, if you stay with that seam allowance, they will fit in beautifully. So I've got my extra strong thread here now with a knot in the end, and all I'm going to do is just sew a quick overcasting stitch to hold that little leg into that curve there. Just going to make my way along, and that just means that we can remove our pins and we won't be battling around those when we're sewing on the machine. I really don't recommend sewing these little sections. These are a key little part of your little elephant's sitting position, and we want that to be absolutely straight, and so that he sits up nice and balanced. So you can see I'm just going to make my way and stitch that little curve in there. Once I've done that, you can take that one to the machine and you can very carefully stitch that little curve. I always stitch everything on this little elephant 2 times, so it's nice and strong. And I set my stitch length on my machine to number 2 because it's a nice tight small little stitch. So I'm going to finish my overcasting stitch, and then I'm going to sew 2 times on that little leg curve. Make sure that you're rotating your work and pulling out and getting everything straight so you've got no puckers as you're sewing that on the machine. Once you've done that, you just repeat with the other side. And remember to make sure that your toes are pointing upwards. So that's how your little elephant will sit. There I have my 2 little inner leg pieces stitched in there, and our next step is to take our side body pieces And before I do anything, I just sew a zigzag stitch, close zigzag stitch on between those two opening marks. That will keep those little edges from stretching. And we want to be able to close that opening when we're finishing up, and it'll be nice and true. So our next step after doing that is we're going to start sewing our body pieces together. Now, when we're working on this little body, when I'm adding these little side pieces to the front gusset, I'm working on the side body piece. I'm not working this way, I'm working this way. And that's because we want our little elephant's body to sit nice and snug like that, and you'd be surprised the difference it makes in soft sculpture on which side that you work. And we do what we call mirror sewing. We're going to do that right throughout this little project. So what we do is line up the top. We've got right sides together, and just line up that top there, and then we're going to bring this down. You'll see that it will line up with your little junction here. Don't worry if you've got a little bit of space there, that's fine. We will just line that up, and we want this little seam to be pressed inwards, so inward into the center gusset. Press that one forward, and then we're just going to line up that little junction, put a pin right through there. And I like to do this in sections. So first, don't worry about your little bit of space there, that's not a problem. So first we're going to stitch to here, to this point. We're going to sew that 2 times like we do, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to line up the bottom section, and then we're going to stitch this section here. So you can do it all in one. I find it easier to do this section, get it stitched on the machine, and then sew this section as well. It just makes it a little bit easier. So there's our one little side of our little body stitched into place there. You can see that there. So now all we need to do is repeat what we just did with the other side, remembering right sides together, and that we're still working, even though we've changed sides, we're working on the side body panel. Again, we're not flipping it over and sewing from this side, because that'll make our body twist. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to pin that one into place, and then line up that foot also, and stitch right the way. So now we have both of those little front leg seams stitched, which creates our little sit position. So our next step, as I go to, I'm always, while I can still get to my seams, I'm rolling them out as I go. It's just easier to get to them now than later. Alright, so our next step is take it back inside out again. And our next seam is our little bottom of our leg here on each side. Again, I'm working on the side panel, and I'm going to just pop my pin in, make sure I've lined that up at the bottom there, and you have a mark on your pattern piece, and that's exactly where your little junction should be, and you can see that it is. And again, we want to be pushing that seam inwards towards the gusset, in towards the center of the gusset. This is all helping our little legs to sit nicely inwards. So you want to make sure that that little mark is lined up right on that junction there, which it is. And we will just 2 times, so that little seam, make sure you're really back and forth here. And then we'll repeat with the other side and line up that one as well with that little seam too. And so our other back leg. There we go, I have my little bottom leg seam sewn there now. And so our next step before we sew our centre back seam is we have to pop in our little tail. Now I like to stitch it in place first. It's going to be tucked in there, and we're going up to sew up the centre back seam. So we want that little tail facing inwards. I've got it about just over a centimetre from the base there. You can see I've just tacked it in on the machine. I'm going to sew this seam and I'm going to be able to trim that off. So we just put those, tuck that little tail in, and we're going to line up that very bottom edge there. Important that these sections are very well lined up for doing our little bottom section. So make sure those corners meet up beautifully, and also our little opening marks. So just check that you've got them all lined up, because we want this opening section to be nice and straight with no puckering, and you'll find your top there will line up beautifully. So where we're going to sew is just from the neck edge here to the start of that little opening, and you really want to go back and forth a few times because that's where we're going to be stuffing. And I just sew that seam 2 times as I have right the way through, and then from the lower edge of that opening all the way to the very base there, and really make sure you go over that tail a few times to make sure that that one is all securely in there. And now that my little centre seam is sewn, we're just going to sew up that little base bottom piece. Now what I've done there is I've just opened out that little back seam just below that tail and flattened it out. And I want to keep that the very centre of that. And I've got my centre mark on my pattern piece. I'm going to take my pin and put it right through there at the seam allowance. And then I'm going to take my pin right through the centre at the seam allowance and straight through that seam. And that will hold that little top section exactly right. And now we just need to pin that little section in. I'll just repeat that on the other side. So I've got that little piece now nice and snug in there, and now I've taken my matching thread in extra strong thread. Now this section here, we can sew that on the machine up to about this curve here where it starts to curve, and the same with the other side. This top curve here, very difficult to get under the machine and keep that all nicely centered, and that's very important. So I'm just going to hand stitch the top curve in, and then I'll take it to the machine and just finish off those little sections on the machine. So I'm using a stab back stitch here, and I've actually got a video that shows you exactly how to do that. I'll put that link in there for you. But it's a fully linked stitch, so I'm just going through both layers of fabric. My stitches are made from behind each time, so I'm staying with my seam allowance and I'm coming in from behind and I'm going back into the hole that I just came out of. So we're backtracking all the time. So I'm coming forward from the underneath, and then I'm going back in the last hole. So it's completely fully linked. It's absolutely the strongest stitch for making any kind of little soft sculpture, but make sure that you're using your extra strong thread. So I will just sew that little curve in and then finish off. Make sure that you really connect up with those two there and finish that off on the machine. Right, so that has our little bottom piece all stitched in. Now our next step is to add our little foot pads, and you've got your little foot pads and they've got their little marks at the heel and toe there, and they're very important. They help us line it all up because this isn't a circle, it's actually an ellipse shape. So we're going to start by popping a needle right on one of those marks in my seam allowance of 4mm. I'm going to take one of my feet. Now this is one of the areas where I guess I'm asking you to step up a little bit. Putting in a foot pad can be a little tricky, but once you know how and you've done a few, it's really quite easy. So I've pressed open, just finger pressed open that seam, toe seam at the top, and I'm just going to go in at the same seam allowance straight through that center seam there, and take my pin all the way through just to anchor that little toe in. And then we're going to do exactly the same on the heel, because sewing these little foot pads in is all about how you pin it in first. That makes all the difference. I've seen so many people do them so many different ways, and it gives me absolute grief, because this is such a simple way and you could make it very hard or relatively easy. So open that little seam out again and just pop that needle in straight through the center there. And because you've kept nicely to your seam allowances, and I'm sure you all have, that little foot pad is going to fit in that little opening absolutely beautifully. It's very important to me that my patterns fit for you all. You don't need extra grief when you're sewing. So pinning this one in, we pin it in 3D. So now I've taken my pin, just lined it up with that edge. I've gone through both layers, and then I just flip that one over and take a little bit on the other side. Might have seen me do this before. And push your pin head all the way down. And we'll follow around. You can see that little foot pad fitting already. And we're going to do the same there. Pin goes through both layers, flip it over, take a little bit from the outer edge and pin head all the way down. That's going to give us a little foot pad pinned in its three-dimensional position. And we're going to be able to sew, and because those pin heads are all the way down, when we're sewing this little foot pad in, we're not catching on pins that are poking out. We have to have these two here. Now I'm just going to pin the other side. So that is my little foot pad all pinned in. You can see now that's perfectly in position. We can see that that's fitting beautifully. So my next step, before I actually sew the seam, is I'm going to take my extra strong thread again, and I'm going to sew that little tacking over casting stitch right the way around, so that I can remove all my pins ready for me to sew that actual seam. So I'm going to make my way all the way around that little foot. Now once you have your little foot pad nicely tacked in, all your pins are out the way, it's much easier to sew that seam now. Now the stitch we use to sew in foot pads is always a stab back stitch. I've got a video that shows you how to do that one. I'll put that link up there for you. And the stab back stitch is the same one that we did on the little top curve of the little bottom there. That little very linked stitch, very, very strong. So I've switched to my correct thread colour now, and that stab back stitch is, I'm going to keep it nice and small, in at my seam allowance, coming in from behind and linking back with the last stitch you just made. And you want to be always mindful that you're sewing a little circle shape, so you want to keep those stitches nice and flowing. And you can see that I'll be able to make my way right the way around. This isn't something that you can do in a hurry. It does take its time. It takes me time too. So, and it's something that you'll get used to doing. So just keep swimming and you'll get there in the end. So I'm going to make my way right around that whole little foot pad. And then I'm going to repeat the process with my second little foot and my second little foot pad. So that has both of my little foot pads stitched in there. And so just before we turn this body through, you can see there that I've taken a double strand of extra strong thread, and I've started at the little back of the neck here, and I've sewn a little running stitch right around that neck edge, left my tails hanging, And once we've done that, we can just pull that little neck in, and we're just going to knot that off a couple of times. We just need to leave a little space for our little neck bolt to go through, so just enough to accommodate that. Pull it in. You see I'm leaving a little space there, and I'll just knot that off a couple of times before I turn that body through. And actually, before I turn that through, we do need to make little holes. You've got your little joint marks there, and we're going to be taking our awl and popping that one through, and then take your knitting needle and just enlarge that hole for our little joints to go through, our little bolts to go through. Now, if you're not going to be jointing your little bear's arms and you're going to button joint them, then just transfer those little markings to the right side of your fabric. Just pop a pin through so you'll know where it is, and make that little mark, because you're still going to have to get those little arms in exactly that right position. So now I can go ahead and turn this little body through. So that has our little body all turned through, and I've gone over that whole little body and rolled all those seams out, so everything's nice and pushed out and ready for filling when we get to there. So we're going to pop that little body aside now, and we're going to start work on our little arms. Now, the two arm styles that I have for you, this one is the little one that I've said at the beginning that is a simplified little arm. So it's a chubby little very simple arm that will curve forwards, and you can see I've already got my joint in place. I've got it all filled and ready for closing. This one is very simple, so you can go ahead with that one. That's the one that I'm doing today. And first of all, so with this style of arm, we've got our two pattern pieces, and before I do anything, you might remember on the little back section of the body, we sewed that little tight zigzag stitch on that opening, both sides, to keep those little edges from fraying. So I've gone ahead and done that first of all, and then our next step with this one, with this little design, is simply to line up all of those edges and make sure that this section here is all lined up. You can go ahead and pin or clip. I don't feel the need to overcast this little one. I go ahead and I sew it on the machine. Now, you'll notice that I'm working on this little arm on the side that is the outer arm. This is the inside of the arm that has a little spot on it, which will be joined to our little elephant. So I'm going to be working on the outer arm. All of my sewing, all of my pinning is going to be done from that outside. And we do that regardless of whether you're jointing with buttons or whether you're jointing the way that I am. The reason I do that is that it keeps the natural curve of when you're working on this little arm this way, that little arm will curve just naturally that way, which is exactly what we want. We want those little arms to tuck in nicely. So when we do this arm, we work from that side, and when we do the other arm, we also work from that side so that it's mirrored. It's what we call mirror sewing, and it makes the world of difference to your little animals. And if you're making bears and you've had little bears' arms do all sorts of strange, odd things, that's why. You need to mirror sew so that both of those little arms tuck in nicely like that. Alternatively, you can work on the opposite side and make them do this. But generally, we like our little animals, everything to be turned in nicely. So what you need to do with this one is just to start at the base of your opening, and you just need to sew all the way around to the top of that opening. Make sure you're back and forth on those edges there and leave that one open. And again, I sew that one 2 times. So that's what we're doing with this little arm. If you're going to be making this little arm, your pattern piece just looks like this. You've still got the same little opening and you've still got that little mark. And again, you will just pin and then you will just sew to the opening, but you will leave this base open because this is for the little paw pad. So you'll just stitch this section, leave this one open, and down to the base here. Then you will need to go ahead, once you've done that, before you turn it through, and you will need to pop in to that little opening your little paw pad, which I'll have there in your templates as well. And you do that exactly in the same way as we just did with these little foot pads. So those are the two different ones. You can go ahead with whichever one you prefer. I'm going to go ahead with this one, so I'm going to go and sew that little second arm up on my machine. So here you can see that little arm is all stitched up, that opening left open, and I've gone ahead as we did before with the little body, and I've just enlarged my little joint hole there. If you are button jointing, you don't need to do that. So next step, and if the same process, if you're making the other version of arms, once your little paw pad is in, you make your little joint mark and make sure that's enlarged enough. So we're just going to turn that one through. Take our knitting needle and just push those seams out. And I've also gone ahead and rolled all those seams out, so that's nicely rounded now. Now if you are button jointing your little arms on, you can go right ahead now and fill up that little arm nice and firm with your polyester filling. If you're jointing, we're going to go ahead and add our little joint. Now you do this in two ways. If you're using one of my little jointing system that you've seen, we're going to glue that little joint in so that we can close up that limb before we add it to the body. So I'm just using my clear craft glue. It's just a quick drying glue that is suitable for fabric. And it's just a little bit on there. It just needs to hold against that fabric for when we do up that little bolt. And I find the easiest way is to take my little forceps, hold on to that one. Here's my little opening. I'm going to tuck that one in and bring it up to that little joint mark. And it's just as simple as that. And we're just going to push that fabric all the way down and make sure that that little section is nicely glued. When we do up our little nuts, that means that that little joint won't spin, so it allows us to tighten that. If you are using plastic or acrylic joints, you don't need to glue them in. You can just pop them in through that hole because they are done up with a snap, not a turn. So this one we've got all settled there, and we're just going to leave that one to dry for about 15 minutes before we go ahead and pack that one full, and I will pack that nice and firm. So while that other little arm is drying, I'm going to jump ahead and we're going to show you this one is already filled up. I don't want this video to get too long. Oh, you'll be sick of the sound of my voice. So I've got that packed nice and firm. You can see that really is nice and firm, and I've taken my wool felting needle and I've been able to pack all of that filling in, and it's nicely away from that opening. And now we're going to close this opening using a ladder stitch, and I also have a video that shows you how to sew a ladder stitch, close an opening. I'll put that link up there for you. But I'm using an extra strong thread, as we always do for a closing. I've got a really big knot at the end, and you can see there, here's the start of where my opening begins. I'm coming in from underneath, right at the start where that last stitch went, in at the seam allowance. That little knot will hold. When I'm doing a closing on an arm, I like to get my thumb in there. It helps me hold those edges out. So now I'm going to travel across to the other side into my fabric and travel down my first stitch. So I'll be keeping them quite small, and I'm keeping still to my seam allowance. So you can see that stitch has come across there, straight across there. So now we're going to give that one a tug, get my thumb in there again, and I'm going to go back into that first little hole that I first came out of. Travel down the same distance. It's important that you keep your stitches the same either side so it's marrying up the same. Pull that one in and you can see that's going to knit that little opening together. As you're working your little ladder stitch, make sure that you're always pulling it in with each stitch. Pulling that one in, encouraging those edges together, give it a pinch, and then we're just going to work our way down. You don't want to get down halfway down and then try and pull all those stitches in, because it won't knit together well. You want to do it each time, even though it will relax a little every time you do the second stitch. So it's just a matter of going back and forth nice and evenly until we get right down and have closed that opening. So that has our two little arms done, all stitched up ready. We can put those ones aside and we can now start on our little ears, which are very simple. I've got my little one all done here. All we need to do, you can see I've just got those two pieces pinned right sides together, and we've got our little opening marks again. So all you need to do with this one is just start at your top of your opening there, and we're going to stitch that same 4mm seam allowance right the way around that whole ear up until the base of that little opening. Make sure you go back and forth. I only sew this little seam just one time. It doesn't need a lot of strength. So you can go ahead and do that, and then we will turn that one through and give it a press. I have just trimmed off those top corners once that little seam is sewn, taken off those top corners, and if you have pinking shears, I've just done that lower edge. It just gives our little ear that nice little curve when we turn it through. So I'm just going to turn that one through and give it a good press. So once I have turned that through and given it a press, I've also pressed that little opening edge, I've pressed those little edges under, and then I've taken it to the machine and I've sewn a top stitch close to the edge, just right the way around that lower edge, not across the top here, because we're going to be folding that little ear and we will be stitching that later. So just from here all the way around to the top, and we've got those two little ears ready to go. So we can also put those aside, and now we can get started on our little elephant's head. So you've got your two side head pieces which we want to match up. Very important to get everything matched up on this little head piece. You've got your little center nose mark at the top here. Make sure that those are lined up, and you want to put your pin or your clip straight through there, and make sure that your little trunk piece at the end is all nicely lined up. So the seams that we're going to be sewing, the same 4mm seam allowance. We're going to be sewing from that little mark there. Make sure you're back and forward. We're going to be following down to the top edge here. We're leaving this little section open. So just right down here to the tip of that little trunk 2 times, and then we're going to sew from the lower neck edge here around to this point and leaving this section open. So both of those seams 4mm, and we sew them 2 times. So that has my 2 little seams stitched in, and our next step is we're going to close the front of that little trunk to give it that nice little tipped up look. First of all, I want you to try and press open those little seams. Just finger press those open, top and bottom, and we're going to bring those seams down to meet each other. If you've got forceps, I find the easiest way is to slot them into the end and pull that little seam apart to try and pinch in those. It's a little bit fiddly. And we're going to match the seams to each other. You can see what I've done there is I've met up those little seams, pinch those together, And what we're going to be doing, I will sew it with a little overcasting stitch first. I will stitch that into place, and then we're just going to stitch it on the machine, just back and forth, to create that little curved end. If you like, you can add your little clip there for a little while, just for a couple of minutes, and it'll help compress that all down, so it's easier for you to sew in your little tacking stitch, and then just sew that nice and firmly on the machine a couple of times. And there you can see that little end of that little trunk stitched into place. Our next step is to add our head gusset. Now again, at the top here, if I can get you to press that little seam open, it just helps us find the center there. And we've got a little head gusset piece. Now you might be able to see that there. I've just put a little mark right in the center, which is at my seam allowance, which is the same either side, right from the end. That little tip will extend a little further, and we're going to start by putting our pin through that hole. And putting our pin through that center seam again, as we have with some of those other points. Just to hold that where we want it. So you can see I've pulled that one to the side now, but I know that it's in the right position because of my center mark and my pin. So push that pin head right the way down, and now I can keep adding my pins, which I will do with my flipped over way, and follow that head gusset. Right the way to follow down to that neck edge. I will pin that all the way around. So there you can see that little head gusset is pinned in, and you'll see that will fit absolutely perfectly down to the neck. And also notice that I'm working on the head gusset. I'm not working on the side of the head. All my work is being done from the top head gusset. So my next step is that I will overcast with my tacking stitch. With my extra strong thread, I will overcast that one into place, but I will start my stitching at that little black mark, and there will be that tip remaining. We need that tip remaining, and you don't ever try and sew both sides in at once. We've got to do it this way so that we get that lovely little point at the front of the little elephant's trunk there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to overcast that one, and then I'm going to stitch on the machine from that little mark. Make sure you back and forth right the way down to the base of the head 2 times. There you can see that little first side of that head gusset stitched in right the way around to the base of that neck. Now, because we've left that little tip there and haven't gone all the way to the end, when we go to match up the other side, you can see that it rotates and it sits into place exactly where it should. So now we just do exactly the same thing with the other side. Pin that one all the way down, sew your overcasting stitch, and 2 times on the machine again. And what you have to make absolutely sure of is that little black mark that was in there, which is where we started. That's where you start on this side, so that that little point is completely sealed and then goes onto that seam there. So make sure you really do back and forth on that little point. And so that gives us our little head gusset all stitched in, and you see with that lovely perfect little point at the front there, so we know that's all going to be lovely and meet up when we turn it through, which we're going to do now. So best way to do that is a little trunk first with your forceps and tuck that one in and all the way out, and then pull that little head through. And so that has our little elephant's head all turned through. You can see our little points have all met up beautifully there, and we've got a little upturned trunk there. So all we need to do is fill this little head with our polyester filling, and I will obviously start right from the tip of that little trunk, and your forceps are great for this. You can go around those little bends. We really want to pack out that little tip best we can. And I will work my way up, packing that little trunk section out and then filling out that head, and we want that all to be really firm. You can see there that there's not much give in that little head at all. It's nice and bouncy and firm, and that makes it so much easier. Whether you're jointing or whether you're sewing that head on, it's going to be much easier for you to work with if it's packed nice and firm. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that one up right up to almost the edge, and use my felting needle as I go to keep on packing that fibre in. Okay, so there we have our little elephant's head all nicely stuffed. You can see how firm that one is. Flip him over and you can see that I've gone ahead with my wool felting needle and I've made that little head base nice and flat and really packed in there. Now we do that regardless of whether you're going to be using a joint to join or whether you're going to be sewing that little head on. My little joint is going to sit just nicely into that little head cavity there, and I'm going to pull in my threads around it. But if you're wanting to sew your head on, you're going to have to make sure that you filled it only to where I have there, because you're going to be wanting to turn that little edge under all the way around, just the tiniest bit. You can sew a running stitch around it, a tacking stitch to keep it in place, because you can always pull that out afterwards. So if you're going to sew your head on, that's what you'll want to do. Turn that little edge under and get that all just neatly sewn into place and ready, and leave that cavity open. Because I'm jointing mine, I've got my double strand of extra strong thread, and I'm going to start at the back, and we're going to sew that little running stitch that will pull in around our little neck joint. And I'm just going to leave my tail ends hanging and just make my way around that entire little neck edge till I come back to here. I can now add my little neck joint, which I have. I've got my little running stitch all the way around there, and I've got my first knot tied so that I can pull that in, and I'm going to compress that little joint in and keep pulling those threads in until I've got that nice and firm around that little bolt, and then I will knot that off at least 3 or 4 times, and I may even run around that little neck edge again and tie it off again, just to make absolutely sure. I'll do that off camera because I really need to hold everything together and I'm not actually an octopus. So I'll get that one tied off and show you how that looks. So that's my little neck joint all popped in there. So now we're going to talk about eyes. So popping our eyes in. Now if you're using safety eyes, to get your eye position correct, you will need to stuff your head temporarily. So a quick fill just to blow out the head and get the proportions right, to mark in your little eye placement. And trust me, don't ever try and guess and put safety eyes in without filling the head and checking that placement, because you will never ever ever get it right. You have to have a filled head to be able to determine where they go, or they can look quite odd. So, but in the case of these eyes, I'm using the teddy bear glass eyes, so we add them after the head is all filled and closed. Now I'm using teddy bear eye pins here, and they actually come in a set, and they're little glass eyes on a pin, so it really helps you determine exactly what size of eye you want to use and exactly where you want them to be. They are available at almost all teddy bear supply stores, so if you're interested in those. So I'm going for 10mm eyes here, and I've got my eye position set. You can see where I've got that. And when we're using glass eyes, remember that they're going to pull in. So make sure that you give it a little squeeze and have a little look at how that's going to look to make sure your positioning is correct. And once you're happy with that, which I am, I've gone ahead and I have made a little hole in each of those positions with my awl. So that's all ready. So now I've got my little glass eye, which is a little eye with a shank on the back. You see there? Now you can use a little shank button. You will have to make sure that this little hole that you've made for your eye is a little bit bigger, big enough to accommodate that shank, which is usually thicker on a button, so it will slip into that little hole. So now I've got my extra strong thread and I've got it doubled over, so I've got a doubled length of it. I've got it doubled over, and the little doubled over end I'm going to pass through that little loop on the eye. Now I'm going to open up my thread loop and pull my two ends through to create that little knot that will hold that eye nice and strong. So once I've got that, I'm then going to thread these ends onto my large doll needle. Take those through. And now I'm ready, and I've got my hole made ready, and I'm going to just go straight in. I'm going to aim to come out the lowest part in the center of the back of the head, just above that disc there. You see that's where I'm coming out. I'm going to pull that one all the way through and make sure that that little eye is actually settled in there. And give that little tug, and you can see how that will go. So now I just repeat that process with the other one. So we get the other one onto our little threads. So here I have my second eye ready, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go straight in, only this time I'm going to pull those threads aside from the first eye, and I'm going to come out with my doll needle right out of that same hole. It must come out of that same hole. Make sure it's clear of any threads and pull that one all the way through. Make sure that one is settled in. And because they're coming out through that same hole, when we tie that one off, we're going to be tying it off into the stuffing. So that's why we need a nice firm head for adding our eyes. The stuffing is what's going to hold those little eyes in place, and also it means we won't be pulling in our fabric and it making a big dimple. So we've got our two ends, and all we need to do is tie our first knot, pull your head around, and you can be squeezing those in and pulling your little threads in and tightening that knot and squeezing those in and tightening that knot until you've got them sunk just as deep as you want. They always will relax a little, so pull them a little tighter, a little deeper than you would want them. And then you just need to knot off those threads, keeping that tension up at least 3 or 4 times. So there you can see I've got a nice little pull in on those eyes, and I have tied those off, and I've rethreaded my ends, and I can just dive back into that same hole and hide those thread ends. Give it a little tug. Those thread ends are lost inside the head, and you can see that that little hole there is quite invisible at the base there, and it isn't pulled in because it's not the fabric that it was stitched to, it was the stuffing underneath. So there we have our nice little, that is it for our little elephant's head. That's the beauty of an elephant, they just have their little eyes to put in. So now we're going to move forward and we're going to assemble our little elephant. Now we're going to assemble our little elephant. Now the two ways of doing it, if you are sewing the head on and you are sewing your button jointing your arms, what you'll need to do now is fill that little body. So starting with the little feet, now you can see I've already filled my little feet nice and firm because it's easier for me to get to it now before I join everything on. So I've got those feet and ankles already filled. If you are going to be sewing your little pieces on, then you need to fill this body up, right up, nice and firm. Make sure you've got your little spots marked in for your arms, and you will need to fill that little body up and then close that opening with a ladder stitch. If you are jointing, then I hope that some of you are giving it a go. We're going to go ahead now and we're going to start, and we're going to add our little head first. So remember, we've got a little spot there, a little hole that little bolt will go through, and we just pop that one through. Now we make sure that all of our fabric is pressed down well around that little neck bolt, and we can get in there and see in there. We've got that all nicely pressed down. And we take our other wooden disc, which is our 40mm, and slip it over the top of that bolt. And we make sure that we haven't caught up any fabric. Make sure that it's all pulled out, and that little disc is sitting nice and flat. And then we can go ahead and add our washer and our little nut. And just finger tighten that one, while you can flick him over and check that you've got nothing tucked up in there, no fabric is caught up, everything's nice and even. Turn him over again, then you can go ahead with your spanner and you can just tighten up that little bolt to as tight as you want it. And you can do it quite firm, you can have it a little looser, it all depends on what you like. I like it to be quite firm, but that I can still move it. And remember, any joints that you ever do up, they will loosen over time as all of those layers compress. So always do it a little bit tighter than what you want it to end up, the flexibility that you want. So I'm going to tighten that up quite tight, and then I'm going to add my little drop of super glue right in here in that little groove, so that little bolt will never come off. So that has my little head firmly on, my couple of little drops of super glue on there, so that bolt will never come off. We all know super glue dries very quickly. Hang him, stand him on his little head, and now we can go ahead and just repeat the same process with our little arms. Straight through that little mark that we've made, making sure all of those fibres are pushed right down around that bolt. Pop on our corresponding disc, our washer, and our little nut. Again, little finger tighten, check our positioning, tighten it to as firm as you like, and then we just add our little super glue just the same. And now, isn't that quicker than sewing them on? I do hope some of you will give it a try, because it really does, it really changes your soft sculpture journey. So I'm going to do those up and add that little one on the other side. So that has our little elephant body all put together. So cute. Beautiful colours. So now all we need to do is finish filling him up. So we're just going to start, we're going to continue, he's having a little rest. We're going to continue filling those little legs out first. with my forceps, and make sure those little thighs, we want nice chunky little thighs, all packed out. And keep going, fill out this little bottom section, work your way up to the top, and make sure that you really fill in nice and firm around that little neck joint and around those little arm joints. Of course, if you are sewing your other pieces on, I will get to you in a moment to show you how to do that. So let's move forward. Let's get this little elephant packed nice and firm right the way to the back. So that has our little elephant all filled out beautifully, and we've got just enough room. I've used my felting needle again to pack all of that filling in so that we can just close that back seam. Now, for all of you who are sewing on your head and arms, now that this one is filled, if that little head wasn't on there and those little arms weren't on there, you would have just this fully packed little body which would be drawn in at the top. Now, if you have watched any of my videos, my animal doll series, the procedure for sewing the head on would be very, very similar. So you've got that little drawn in neck, and you have your little open, remember I showed you that little open neck that you had your little edge turned under, and all you would need to do is you do the head first so that you don't have things in your way, and you just drop that little head over that little top of that little neckline, pop your pins in all the way around, and then you would just slip stitch all the way around that little neck cavity. And as I tell you in my little animal doll series, the firmer you have that little body packed, the easier it will be to sew on that head. So that's what you need to do for the head. As far as the little arms go, you've got your little joint positions marked. You would need a large doll needle and your extra strong thread, which would be doubled, and you would need a little button for each of the arms right here. And so what you are going to do is to pass your thread through your little button, through your little arm, and through your little joint spot, and you're going to travel through the little body, through the other joint spot, through the little arm, through the other button, and back again. Then you're going to go back through the same process and back through and back through, and you can do that about 4 or 5 times, and then you just cast off behind and knot off somewhere that can't be seen, and you'll have your little arms will be joined and pulled in quite tight with those 2 little buttons. Now, the only one I've got to show you is my little monkey. So you can see he's still got movement in those little arms, and he has been jointed that way, where we've just passed through with our nice long doll needle back and forth until those little arms are nice and secure and still got some movement. Now, what it will do though, remember when you're button jointing, it does compress the top of the little arms, which is why I like the joints with the elephant, because I wanted her to be all lovely and rounded. You can see that it does compress those, so you would get more of this effect where it was more squeezed in at the top. But another good result, you will have a lovely result. Just take your time with sewing those little pieces on, and you get to where we are now. So you will have already had your back section stitched up, but my last task on the actual body work here is to go ahead and sew with my extra strong thread. I'm just going to sew that same ladder stitch that we've used to close our little openings on our arms. I'm just going to sew that one all the way down here to finish off that little elephant body. So there we have our little back all stitched up. If you're having any troubles with sewing up a ladder stitch on a little curve like that, try using a curved needle. It can really help you out, helps you really capture those stitches. Okay, so next step is just to add our little ears, and it's actually done really simply with this one. I actually like the idea of the little stitching showing. So I've done a little blanket applique stitch because it gives us a nice little hinge on those ears, and it keeps everything sitting nice and flat and nice and floppy. So I'm choosing a colour that will go with my little project. You can actually really make it stand out because we're not trying to hide these stitches. Positioning of these ears, have a good look at that. You can see exactly where I've got them pinned. Make sure they're lined up both sides and far enough back. It's not hitting the shoulders and it's just sitting nicely in front. You can see that the first corner, well, first of all, what I've gone ahead and done is folded that little ear in half. I didn't say that. Fold the little ear in half and stitch that one closed. So now we've got a little guideline to make our little stitches too. So you can see that I've just dropped that one just about 1/2 centimetre from that little top gusset line stitching seam, and then the back section I've brought up to meet that little seam line, and it just gives it a lovely little angle. So once we've got that all sorted, we've got them pinned into place, I'm using my extra strong thread. You could use a pearl thread. I'm coming inside the ear so that we can hide that knot in there. So the stitch I'm going to be doing is actually a blanket applique stitch. So I do have a video that shows you how to sew a blanket applique stitch. I'm using it in a different way here, but I will put that link up the top there for you. So I want to come out, where I'm aiming to come out is I've dived into the head there, and I want to come out just at the first edge, just like you would with a blanket appliquing a shape. I know we're doing it in 3D here. So I've come out right on the edge and it's on the head part. So pull that one all the way through, and then we go ahead and we make our first stitch, and this is our stitching line, which is awesome. We've got a good little guide there. So you want to make sure that you get in there and you capture some of that backing fabric, and there's a few layers there to get through. And we come out, give that one a tug, and we must make sure that we're coming through that loop so that that's going to create that little binding stitch. So I'm going to pull that first one in, then I can take my little pin out. So that's my first little stitch, and I always do 2 right on top of each other. And really pull that one in tight. So then our next stitch, we're just going to travel along just as we would if we were sewing a blanket applique stitch, and making sure that you're taking enough of that little head from behind to pull that little one in onto the head. Encourage it with your thumb. So you can see I'm just going to work that stitch right the way across, and make sure on that front edge that you do those same 2 tight little stitches before you can dive into your fabric, and you can knot off underneath that ear and snip your threads. And there we have our finished little elephant. You can see those little ears stitched on with that little stitch there. I really found that to be the easiest way to pop them on. I've gone ahead and added that little flower with the little button, simply just gone through my button, through a little bit in the head, back out through the button, and tied that one off. It's that simple. There's so many ways that you can embellish this little one. You can put little things around their neck and little bows, little ruffles. I'm sure you'll all come up with some fabulous ideas of how to add some glam and so on, or keep them just as they are. And I cannot pick between the little arms. So I'm surprised. I really love them both. I really can't choose, because these little chubby ones, they're really sweet and they're great for if you want to speed up the process. So tell me what you think. Tell me what you think. What are your favourite arm shapes? I love them both. So I hope you've really enjoyed this one. I've had an absolute ball putting her together, and I hope you do too. Well, thank you all for watching today. Hope you enjoyed making Little Miss Elephant. And I hope I've converted some of you over to trying some simple jointing work, and you can see today that it's really easy, and it means I can design some incredible things for you in the future, and I really want to do that. So everybody let me know how you went with it, and if you'd like to see more, and I'll certainly I'm taking it nice and slow, and I'm sure you can all get on board. So make sure you follow me on Instagram, and you can see the little projects coming together. You can see them from when they start swirling around in my head sometimes, and then they eventually end up something like this. And I hope all of you who were waiting for elephants, I hope you're happy with the result. So I've enjoyed this little project. I certainly hope you have. You could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beautiful if you have enjoyed this video. Make sure everybody stays safe. Look forward to my next videos. I've got something festive coming up, so you'll have to watch. You'll have to watch me on Instagram. You might get a sneaky peek. So in the meantime, everybody, all of those wonderful things that come to you in your day, just remember, make sure that you share them. Make sure that you pay them forward. And until next time, it's Huru from me.